Still monitoring what is happening there in New York on the UN General Assembly stage. But as we do that, we just reflect on what is going to happen over the next couple of days. The debate, UN General Assembly debate, the theme being on 80 years of existence of the UN, will of course continue up until the weekend, and we look at what is expected of President Cyril Ramaphosa as he addresses the UN General Assembly. We saw we saw US President Donald Trump address them, lashing out at the UN, saying that they've lost sense of their purpose and that they have not even helped him end the wars that he has, and he spoke about the end of the war with Iran. And of course he is also looking at his interventions in the GRC and between Israel and Palestine at the moment. But on these one-on-one engagements, let's speak about also what the president is going to look at tomorrow. He's going to give opening remarks at the Trade and Investment Executive Dialogue. The event is hosted in collaboration with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We're joined now by International Relations Analyst Dr. Charles Sinkala to just speak to us through the issues that are going to arise. Dr. Sinkala, very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. President Cyril Ramaphosa addresses the UN General Assembly. In what atmosphere would you say? On the one hand, we have seen the UN human rights organ shore up South Africa's case by saying genocide is indeed occurring in Israel, but that too has led to a rather tense relationship with the United States that has seen the US ladle on more sanctions on South Africa as a result.
Yes, it is saddening that to hear that, nations such as United States of America still continues with the support of Israel, which has committed genocide in Palestine, while the world recognizes Palestine as a state. I think United Nations and other parties which are, conveyed at the United Nations Security Council is to recognize and respect the sovereignty of other nations. Article 213 and other articles which have been enshrined in the United Nations Charter prescribed a mandate of bilateral respect, to sovereign countries and recognition. That has to be abide to it. We cannot have a unilateral, decision by states such as the United States of America, to continue, to support Israel at the hymn that they continue to violate international laws, violate international agreements of recognitions of states such as Palestine. I think, in the world that we live in, we have to respect jurisprudence in terms of territorial integrity and sovereignty of nations such as Palestine, in terms of addressing these issues. When one considers the aspects of only one nation without putting into consideration of other nations' interest, without recognizing the objective of nations, becomes a challenge.
Dr. Sinkala, let me then ask you this question. As you say, there should be unity over such issues that are life and death, and it could actually see a generation wiped out. But the reality is that the UN General Assembly, as it sits there, is not united. We've seen US President Donald Trump address European nations saying they'll go to hell on the starts that they've taken on Palestine recently. But we've also seen countries, even on African soil, take a protectionist, nationalist viewpoint on their relations with the US because of fear of not wanting to miss out on benefits of being a good trading partner or having good bilateral relations with the US. Ultimately, this debate, the 80th anniversary of the UN is a very important one. But how do you foresee it ending? With greater resolve to stand by preventing human rights violations, or is there going to be even greater chasms seen?
Yeah, it is indeed saddening when nations, become subservient to other nations while they are on the level field in terms of recognition. Simply because United Nations is specifically dependent on the United States funding for the operative of the United Nations Security Council. Things such as what has happened in the wars across the world, where unilaterally nations decide which side they should support. And it becomes a challenge when I know and understand fully that allies should support, nations that they believe that their international policy aligns with their national policies. But, objectively looking at the issues that are surrounding the nations that are, unilaterally having a beef with other nations which are, purporting genocide in such a nation such as Palestine. I think geopolitics must coin to a position where they can recognize and look at issues objectively rather than subjectively.
Okay, so we're going to see President Cyril Ramaphosa give the opening address at the Trade and Investment Executive Dialogue tomorrow, an event that's going to be hosted in collaboration with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Given, as we mentioned, the tense relations with the United States government, how strategically important is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in terms of racketing up more investments? Does it have greater sway or as much sway as, say, multilateral, bilateral relations with the U.S. government? Can South Africa count on investment from, based on their relations with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce?
Well, they can base on the relations with the United States. South Africa stands as a position where United States of America is much needed in terms of trade and investment and other treaties that they have signed over the time. But these treaties and the trade and investment must be bilaterally, in agreement in terms of policies for the both countries, to recognize their benefits, on the win-win situation. It cannot be a one-way road. And President Ramaphosa, has been, putting this strategically in the position that let's be on the dinner table. I can also recall my friend Professor Lumumba, from Kenya, who has also said Africa must be on the dinner table, not to be like food to be eaten or a spoon or waiters, but we must be full participants, in the negotiations and in the setting up of tariffs between the two countries. I see that 56% of what South Africa exports to the United States of America has been, tariffs that has been exposed. But while United States of America demands in excess of 77% that they must have free tariffs, in terms of dealing with the country, United States of America, we cannot achieve such an imbalance in terms of trade.
Now, on the one hand, U.S. President Donald Trump is saying to Americans regarding the economy that the tough stances that he's taken, particularly on tariffs, is that it will result in a bit of an ache for the U.S., but that it won't be for a very long time, that it's in the short term for a better economy in the long run. South Africa, which is feeling the pinch of that policy, also has to give a little if it's asking for foreign direct investment, if it's trying to increase jobs, deal with the energy insecurity and the infrastructure deficits, it obviously also has to make some concessions. What can it make in the face of misinformation that has driven the Trump tariff policies towards it?
Well, Trump policies has been based on political ideologies and political mileage. And I think nations must go beyond tariffs that are motivated by political and geopolitics. We must understand that the world now has to be based on, policies that also puts into consideration in terms of sovereignty of other nations' interest. Unilaterally interests of policies where they're dominated becomes a challenge. But United States of America, nevertheless, on the other side, has over the years a narrative of dependence, where we have seen what has happened over the years, that United Nations has procured interest in terms of spearheading such as CDS or CDF's narratives in terms of supporting nations, either through CDF or PEPFAR or USAID and other funding mechanisms that has been supporting governments, especially in South Africa, where they've been funding quite a larger chunk in terms of either health infrastructure or any other platform. Helping nations such as South Africa in terms of health and infrastructure cannot equalize to a nation to heed or to be subservient to nations such as the United States of America to hear or redirect any other narratives that the policies the United States of America has presented without recognizing what is the interest of South Africa. What would be the interest of South Africa in terms of the foreign policy, in terms of recognizing nations that are in dire stress,
All right.
in terms of conflict. And I think South Africa has put up a international policy where they have recognized Palestine as a state.
Dr. Sinkala, allow me to just pause you there for a minute, because President Cyril Ramaphosa has in fact ascended to the stage at the UN General Assembly 80th debate. Let's hear what he has to say on some of these issues. We go back now to International Relations Analyst Dr. Charles Sinkala, who's been listening into us to that address to share his thoughts. Dr. Sinkala, I'd like to get your impressions. If we were saying that US President Donald Trump held no punches when he was addressing the UN General Assembly earlier on, how would you characterize how President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa handled his presentation?
I feel sad, that President Cyril Ramaphosa can, go to an extent, to plead to the world that there's nothing more meaningful than the United Nations founding charter in terms of preserving the humanity and handing down the arms and the escalation of war across the world. The latter, presentation of Donald Trump's presentation at the United Nations General Assembly has been, idealized in terms of respecting only one unilateral nation, forgetting the 80 years of the accumulation and the repeated, response in terms of addressing the United Nations, main purpose in terms of this world.
So, Dr. Sinkala, I was speaking on just some of what President Cyril Ramaphosa said, and he spoke about economic cohesion. Now, this is the one thing that I want to talk about, because he spoke about how trade is being weaponized against countries, and of course South Africa would know about that. We spoke about it, you and I, earlier on, and he spoke about unprecedented unilateral trade policy. Your interpretation of what President Cyril Ramaphosa is trying to effect with these speech, very strong words that he's using. Is he trying to garner more support? Is he trying to say that countries need to allow each other to have freedom, to have the strategic multilateral alignments that they have?
Yes, indeed, Sapito. I think what is significant to note from President Ramaphosa's speech is that the United Nations has significantly failed to project what it, to present its founding mention for the past 80 years. We've seen wars in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've seen the escalation of military in the Palestine and Israel conflict, and many others in the world. That countries such as the United States of America, who's supposed to be in the forefront in terms of establishing mechanisms to de-escalate military support within these nations, has continuously, supported, the vying of policies of the United Nations. I think he has come out very strongly, and I think, as I mentioned, when we got disconnected, that President Cyril Ramaphosa and the whole entire, South Africa and the international policy will go down in history. That it's the only country that I'm aware of, in the African continent, if not in the world, that has boldly, spoken against, the United Nations Security Council, which has purportedly, purposely, brought up, a narrative that, they maintain peace and security. Meanwhile, the opposite has been done. And I think the message was very clear. And as well, the former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, also he mentioned that Africa cannot speak, on the position that, Africa is excluded, from the, the point of interaction of the United Nations Security Council, where matters has been left escalated and weaponizing, geopolitics and making unilateral, policies in the world, which has done nothing but exacerbating, the dehumanizing and the violation of human rights across the world.
Just a final question, and I'm going to juxtapose these 2 points that President Cyril Ramaphosa made, saying that the UN report found an unprecedented rise in expenditure on military exercises. But then he also used South Africa's presidency of the G20 to point out that there will be the first ever report on global inequality delivered to G20 leaders because of this committee chaired by Professor Joseph Stiglitz that they have appointed. What was your reading into this of where South Africa stands as a leader in the world and what is happening against the backdrop?
Well, South Africa seems to be consistent, in terms of its founding and the background, especially coming from the background of apartheid, and segregation and violation of human rights. And I think South Africa stands in history, to remain consistent in terms of human violations in South Africa, it's human violations in the United States of America, it's human violations in Italy, it's human violations in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and any other parts of the world. Unlike other nations, which has changed their policies depending on the allies that they are affiliated to, I think the world should now start thinking in terms of making policies that are multilaterally or bilaterally, dependent or affects other nations.
Okay.
I hope that this United Nations Security Council will revise its policies because, like I mentioned a bit earlier, that the United Nations in itself has failed, to preserve and to protect citizens of this world in
Okay.
terms of its founding up.
All right, Dr. Sinkala, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there, Dr. Charles Sinkala. And of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa ending with that call for reform, saying that Africa, which has 1.8 billion people, and South America are not represented at the UN Security Council. And that brings us to 2 minutes to 10. Well, just about getting there. And we find out now from Shayla and Tukumela what to expect from African Diaries this evening.